In this presentation, I'm going to share with you a couple of concepts about future-proof organizations and the concept of an organizational operating system and how to change it. First, let's start with a question. You see here an organizational chart. What year is it from? I often get answers ranging from 1900 to 2000 or even today or tomorrow. And actually this one is from 1910. It's pretty difficult to carbon date this org chart. If I would have shown you any other object from 1910, you would immediately recognize it as antique, right? Like a pair of shoes from 1910 or a bicycle from 1910. You immediately know that it's about 100 years old and that these days we do it differently. And for some reasons, the way we model our organizations, but also the way we run our organizations is actually pretty similar. And I think that's about to change. Here's another question for you. If you can take a look at this slide and read through some of these statements, do you recognize some of this? Maybe, hopefully not today in your organization, but over the last 5 or 10 years. Have you ever encountered these or heard frustrations at birthday parties? And then the question is, what is this? Often we hear that these are statements from what we found in our work as organizational change agents, but actually it's something different. It is the sabotage manual of the CIA. It's actually true. It's a recently declassified document, and you can look it up, of how to bring an organization to its knees. Basically, they sent these instructions to the CIA agents after the war and asked them to implement some of these rules. And for some reason, over the course of a lifetime, our way of working has sometimes, has shifted from something that's obvious sabotage to something that might be undistinguishable from actual work. So we have some work to do. But first, let's take a look at where this came from. Roughly 100 years ago and even longer ago, this is what work looked like. We had local, small businesses. It's the artisan economy. So here's a picture of a shoe shop. You would know who's working there. You would know what they're doing. It's all very small and simple. And obviously, it was the crafts economy. So people that were working here, they would really learn a craft from a master, and they would become very good at what they're doing. But that's obviously not very scalable. Not long after that, this is what work started to look like. So the industrial age started to grow, and because of our technology, we were now able to rapidly scale up our production. So no longer are we producing 1 or 2 shoes a day. We want to produce 500 of them today. So how do you do that? So Frederick Winslow Taylor and some of his associates came up with the idea of scientific management. And using scientific management, they solved the problem of how do we get people from the farms and from the villages into the cities and get them productive as soon as possible. And the way they figured it out is to chop off every piece of the process into small steps. And they would write those steps on an instruction card, and they would simply send it to the people that are on the work floor. The only thing these people had to do was simply follow the instructions, and then everything would be working fine. This is actually when the concept of management was invented. It's basically separating out the thinkers, who are the managers, who are figuring out how to do the process, how to do the work, and the doers, which is the people that have to follow the orders. A lot of our current day management practices and organizational practices are still based on this fundamental idea that was invented about 100 years ago. It was super successful. We can be dismissive of it, but it actually allowed us to scale up our production and become, we had this huge increase in productivity. Until it didn't. So here's some recent data. Roughly, an average lifespan of an organization is going down rapidly. In the 1960s, your company would exist for about 65 years, and that's now really going down to 15 years, which is pretty tough. You're either in mergers and acquisitions, or you're in crisis mode. There's lots of companies that are struggling to stay alive. And also, for some reason, we have now rockets that can land back on a ship in the middle of the ocean. But why isn't our productivity increased that much, right? Why is it that we have all this fancy technology, but our return on assets, for example, is also not going through the roof? We're doing less with more, and it's harder for organizations to produce. Another data point here is employee engagement. From studies, worldwide studies in all different countries, you see pretty much the same pattern, that 16% of the workforce is actively engaged, and many people are pretty unhappy in their current jobs. And actually, sometimes you can compare it with a birthday party, right? You invite 100 people and 51 of the people hate you. Well, that's kind of our current day economy. So it's pretty bad, and I think we're struggling with finding ways to get out of this. And all of this is kind of teeing up to the idea that we need a different operating system. We can no longer rely on the way of working that was over 100 years old, and we have to reinvent it because people are not enjoying it. We're not really getting much productivity out of it, and there's just the world is just changing too rapidly to keep going in the current way. Because actually, if you think of the picture in the factory, we are no longer solving linear problems where we just can cut it up in steps and follow the orders. We now need to have people that are self-managed, that are solving tough problems together, and basically the traditional management hierarchy is too slow for that. So we need a different operating system. The metaphor of an operating system can also be explained like, if you have the operating system in your computer, it's the software that enables everything. And if you don't upgrade the software for a while, you will not be able to run any modern apps on it. So that's one way to think of it. I want to give you an example of an operating system. So here is two different operating systems that are trying to solve the exact same problem. So on the left, you'll have an intersection with traffic lights, and on the right, you'll have a roundabout. Both operating systems have the same objectives, right? As much throughput as possible and as little as accidents as possible. But both of them approach their problem from a very different mindset, from a very different assumption. So on the left, you'll have the assumptions on the left is that people have to be told what to do. We have to sit down and wait for the centralized system to tell us if it's safe or not to go in the intersection. And on the right, that's very different. We are trusting our people to navigate this complex problem of going on the crossing or not. It asks more of our people, the system on the right. But actually, the outcomes are also much better, right? So a roundabout has a much higher throughput. It also has a much lower fatality rate in accidents. But somehow, still, traffic lights in many countries are the standard. Also, traffic lights are not as resilient as a roundabout, right? If the light goes out, it's not working anymore. So the fundamental difference between these two systems is that the left one is based on control and compliance. We're going to plan out everything that could possibly happen and have a system tell the users what to do. And the other one is based on trust and autonomy. We trust our people to be capable and willing to do the right thing and let them decide how to navigate the situation. And it's not necessarily a full shift from left to right. You can definitely figure out what is the right balance. How much trust and autonomy do we need in a certain part of our organization? And how much control and compliance do we need in this corner? It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. A roundabout is not the best solution for any type of intersection, for example. So a lot of this work came out of the research we've done for our book called Brave New Work. For the book, we interviewed 100 different organizations that we knew were progressive, that we knew were evolutionary or different. In some way, their operating system was pretty radical to the ones we knew. And we started asking them, so what is special about your way of working? And then we got all these answers. And over time, a pattern emerged. These 12 fields emerged through those interviews. So a lot of organizations were doing purpose very differently, right? They are organizing around purpose. Some of the organizations started saying that, well, the thing that's special about us is the way we run our meetings, for example, or the way we share power and make decisions, the way we think about authority. So this is the OS canvas. And inside an operating system, it's the operating system canvas. And inside are the beliefs, principles, and practices on which an organization runs. And you can use this as a reflection tool and a conversation tool. So, for example, when it comes to authority, how do we share power and make decisions? right? And when it comes to organizational change, we really quickly start thinking about structure, for example. We feel structure is the thing to do, but there's 11 other ways to approach organizational change, and maybe keep the structure for a while the same while we experiment with doing meetings differently, or while we experiment of talking about how we share and use our data, for example. So we're going to play with this a little bit further down in the session. A new class of companies are leading the way. So in the book, there's there's 100 different organizations, and you probably know some of them in your space. We have Handelsbanken, for example, that are pretty famous from running their organization highly decentralized, where the local affiliates have a high number of autonomy in any decisions they make. Although you may or may not know much more about that than I do. But for example, also Morningstar, which is a totally different company, is a tomato processing company where people decide their own job description and also their own salary. And the way they run that is to send each other's letters each year to describe what everyone wants to be making and what everybody wants to be doing. And it's about peer reviewing their those things. So we can talk about all of these examples or not. It's the point here is that there's many different companies in many different sectors that have a pretty radical operating system, and we can learn from all of these, and we then can decide what we want to take away and what we want to ignore, basically. But the two fundamental mindsets that we found in most of these radical organizations are these two. One is people positivity. And I talked about that a little bit with the roundabout. If we create an organization where we have the conditions for autonomy, mastery, and purpose, we know that we'll get the most out of our people. People will wake up in the morning and be intrinsically motivated and engaged to make the most of their jobs, if these ingredients are present. It's about organizing around trust and respect, where we are not treating our people as toddlers and telling them what to do, or using bureaucratic processes that require many approvals, for example. So it's about creating freedom within certain constraints. And on the right, it's the complexity conscious mindset. So any of you who are familiar with agile practices, it's all based on the idea that we now can no longer plan for a long period of time, but we have to sense and respond. We have to try something and then inspect and adapt. And just acknowledging that sometimes we're working in complexity, which allows a very different emergent approach. And both of these mindsets are present in future of work organizations. And some are very focused on complexity conscious, but are not very people positive. So, for example, when you think about Uber or Facebook, they are extreme learning machines and are able to influence people's behavior and really get value out of their product, but they're not super people positive in some ways. Another example, there are also like NGOs that are very people positive, but are very stubborn and aren't able to learn and evolve and innovate. So you basically need both of these mindsets. I want to shift gears a little bit to some theory about changing an operating system of an organization. Right, so if you want to change, you're like, okay, good. We want to move to the future of work. We want to change our work practices all over the OS canvas. But how do we do that? Because the way we change also needs to be more focused on a people positive and a complexity conscious way. Because our organizations are also not simply machines. A group of human beings together as a culture is not easily changed. So a couple of our lessons and takeaways from our work. First and foremost, change, run your change through them and not to them. So this is why we call our change method participatory change. The way teams change their work practices is not by a very charismatic leader saving the company, but it's actually done through many, many sessions with teams locally, trying to make sense of what could be better. So involving the people in the change and letting them create their own meaning around what they feel once changed. Learning by doing. For those of you who have kids, you'll probably know that there's not a lot of bicycles anymore with side wheels, because at one point of time they figured out that the best way to learn how to balance, how to ride a bike, is to quickly as possible learn the balancing skill. So on the right, you'll see how it's done. You can plan for years and years how you're going to ride the bike, what angle you're going to use, what velocity, but that will not really give you any experience on how, in lessons to actually do it. So learning by doing, getting out of the planning and predicting mindset, but just trying a lot of things and see if it works for you and if it doesn't. The other principle in our change work is starting small. Right, so there's a tendency there's a tendency to make a huge change and change all the structure, change the whole budgeting process, whatever. But the best way we found over time to get good at change is to do a lot of small things, which over time unlocks bigger things. So start getting into the habit and building the muscle of continuously changing. That allows you over time to change bigger things too, but not do it at the beginning. Start by stopping is one of my favorite ones. Change work is not always about adding an additional meeting or adding an additional ceremony or work practice. It could also be about getting rid of stuff and see if we really miss it. So here's an example from our client work. One of our clients had over 40 hours of scheduled meetings in their agenda. And this was a boardroom team, and they're really frustrated because they had no time in their week to do any other work. So we helped them to try an experiment. So let's get rid of all meetings for a month. Just literally don't allow any planning of meetings. Announce to the organization that if you need us, we're sitting in this corner every day. You know where to find us. And then for a month, they had no meetings at all. And then after a month, they did a retrospective and thought about, okay, so which of the meetings did we actually miss? And which of the meetings could we or should we reintroduce to really help us move the work forward. So which of them we missed? We reinstalled about 15 hours of meetings, and their agendas looks very different now. Joining the resistance. So there's this tendency in traditional change management to kind of try to manage resistance, and some of that work is about explaining the change again, and continuously reinforcing the message, and then still people are surprised that people resist. Very often what we've learned is that resistance to change actually contains very good data and very good information. So when we encounter change resistance, the best way to approach it in our mind is to approach that with curiosity and not try to convince them of something, but try to really listen, like what is the concern behind their resistance that we haven't really thought of or that we haven't really considered. So taking the change resistance as data instead of and as a starting point for learning instead of something that needs to be managed or need to get rid of. I'm close to the end here. Continuous participatory change. This is what it looks like in practice. It's actually a pretty simple loop. So the kind of muscle we want to build in organizations is this loop of continuously changing in small steps and with the people that are involved in the change. So participatory change. So how does it work? It starts by noticing tensions. And one question that you can use, and we're going to play with that later in an exercise too, is what is stopping us from doing the best work of our lives? And I really love this question because you can ask it at every level of the organization and everyone will have an answer. Some people say, well, we have too many meetings, or we have, we are never able to do the thing we actually want to do. So what are some of the tensions? And a tension could be it's not always negative. It's like a spark of energy for positive improvement. So start with noticing tensions and then figure out what are some possible future of work practices that we could try. So what is a people positive or complexity conscious version of the thing we're doing? And you can look into lots of different places for inspiration. And then when you've picked a practice you want to try, then run an experiment. And this experiment should be not just an experiment, it should be a pretty disciplined, time-bound experiment where you say, well, we're going to do this for four or 10 times. And then after this, we're going to learn. And we're going to measure if the experiment is successful or not by certain metrics we define up front. And because we also have to acknowledge that we cannot really predict if a practice that comes from another company actually works here. So in order for us to figure that out, we just have to try it and see if it works, and that gives us more information if it's solving our tension or not. And where to start, right? So in your case, there's lots of different things happening in lots of different places, lots of different countries, and we are trying to use the OS Canvas as a tool to connect the dots, basically. So where to start transformation? Everything at once, not recommended. We could definitely do one department at a time, like take one chunk of the organization and go deep and change a lot of things. You can run scattered experiments, or you can, for example, upgrade one practice at a time. So if the organization is really struggling with speed of decision making, why not introduce a bunch of modern decision making practices and make sure people are skilled in that? I guess this is a useful picture because I think all of it is happening at the same time, and it's the most important thing here is to connect the learnings, connect the dots, and I think the OS Canvas can help us understand what is happening where, and what are some leverage points for the board to go even further and to unlock bigger changes. And that basically concludes my presentation.